The air left my lungs like I'd been hit with a bat. I was standing under the hard, fluorescent glow of the private dining room at Caraway House, my fingers still damp from the condensation on a water glass, when my father rose from the end of the polished walnut table and held his phone up for everyone to see. The screen reflected off the silverware and crystal tumblers in small, cold flashes. My stepmother, Vivian Mercer Hale, had one manicured hand pressed to the pearls at her throat and the other flat against the linen runner as if steadying herself for impact. My younger half-brother, Grant Hale, leaned back in his chair with his ankle propped over one knee, jaw tight, trying to look bored and failing. Across from him, the family attorney, Martin Kessler, adjusted his cufflinks and kept his eyes on me with the careful blankness of a man billing by the hour. My father's voice cut across the room like a box cutter. "You stole from this family," he said. "Not, we need to discuss something. Not, there's been a misunderstanding. Just the accusation. Public. Clean. Final." A server in a black jacket froze beside the sideboard with a tray of lamb chops. Grant's fiancée, Celeste Warren, stopped halfway through lifting her wineglass. Even my Aunt Rebecca, who had spent the first half of dinner talking about a charity gala in Buckhead, went silent so fast I could hear the soft hum of the recessed lighting and the tiny clink of ice settling in someone's drink. My father turned the phone so the table could see. On the screen was a screenshot of a wire request bearing my name, my digital signature, and an account line from Hale Capital Holdings. $1.8 million. An outgoing transfer initiated 2 nights earlier. Vivian inhaled sharply. I knew it. Grant leaned forward, elbows on the table now, his smile thin and eager. "Say something, Ava." Celeste didn't say a word. She just lowered her glass and looked at me with wide eyes, like she was watching something unpleasant through a restaurant window. "My name is Ava Elaine Hale. I'm 36, and this is the story of how I let my father disown me in a room full of witnesses, then quietly dismantled the empire he thought he could use to bury me." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the screenshot, then at the details around it, the battery level, the crop line, the missing header, the fact that the transfer number had been partially cut off in a way no bank-issued confirmation ever would be. Then I looked up at my father. Walter James Hale had spent most of his 63 years learning how to weaponize certainty. He was broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, immaculate in a navy Brioni suit, the kind of man who still believed silence from other people meant obedience. He kept one hand on the back of his chair and the other around his phone, so tightly the tendons stood out along his wrist. "Where did you get that?" I asked. Grant barked a laugh. "That's your first question." Vivian turned toward him, then back to me, lips pinched. "Don't play clever." "Not tonight." Martin Kessler finally spoke. "Ava, if there's an explanation, now would be the time." There it was, the script they had written for me. Deny, stammer, cry, maybe plead, give them something messy to point at later. Instead, I pulled my chair back and sat down again. Slowly, the velvet seat whispered against the hardwood floor. I folded my napkin once and set it beside my plate. My father's nostrils flared. "You think this is a game?" "No," I said evenly. "I think it's a performance." Grant's chair legs hit the floor with a sharp crack. "You smug little—" "Grant," Vivian snapped, though her eyes never left me. She liked order, but only when she controlled it. My Aunt Rebecca looked between us, her fingers worrying the stem of her glass. "Walter, maybe this should have been handled privately." "No," he said without looking at her. "She embarrassed this family. She can answer in front of this family." That line would have landed better if he hadn't chosen one of Atlanta's most expensive members-only dining rooms to deliver it. Caraway House had dark paneling, brass sconces, and enormous black-and-white photographs of old money pretending it had never been new. This was not a family conversation. It was theater with dessert service. Martin slid a folder across the table. "There are 3 additional items," he said. "An internal access log, a beneficiary update request, and a compliance flag, triggered by the transaction." He opened the folder toward me. Inside were printouts, my credentials, my login timestamp, a beneficiary amendment adding an LLC called Northmere Advisory Group, and a notice from First Harbor Private Bank. At a glance, it looked airtight. Vivian lifted her chin. "After everything your father has done for you." I almost smiled at that. Vivian always said, your father, when she wanted to sound noble, and Walter, when she wanted him angry. Grant tapped the paper with one finger. You had access. You had motive. You've been frozen out since the board vote. It doesn't exactly take a genius. I wasn't frozen out, I said. He grinned. Really? I turned to him. You and I have very different definitions of power. His grin faltered, but only for a second. My father placed his phone face down on the tablecloth with deliberate care. You've been resentful for years, ever since I put Grant on the acquisitions track. Grant was put on the acquisitions track because he nearly ruined investor relations and needed a department where his mistakes would be easier to hide. Grant surged halfway out of his chair. Celeste put a hand on his sleeve, nails pale against his jacket. He shook her off. You think you're better than everyone in this room, he said. No, I replied. Just better at reading financial documents. The silence that followed was absolute. Martin cleared his throat. Ava! My father leaned in. You will return every cent tonight. You will sign a resignation letter. And if you force me to, I will refer this to the U.S. Attorney's Office by morning. There were the witnesses he wanted. My aunt, Grant, Celeste, Vivian, Martin. The server still hovering near the sideboard, pretending he couldn't hear. A small audience for a ritual killing. I let my gaze drift across the table, taking each of them in. Vivian's fingers pressing too hard into the linen. Grant's knee bouncing once under the table. Celeste staring at the documents instead of at me. Martin with his careful neutral expression, and a bead of sweat beginning at his hairline. Then I reached into my handbag, took out my phone, and unlocked it. Vivian laughed softly. Are you texting someone for help? No, I said. I'm preserving evidence. My father's face went still. I set the phone on the table and hit record. The red bar appeared at the top of the screen. Grant scoffed. You're unbelievable. I know, I said calmly. That's why you should all be very careful about what happens next. For the first time that evening, nobody interrupted me. I rose, lifted my water glass, and took one slow sip. Then I looked at my father and said, If you want to accuse me of theft, Walter, you should at least use a forged document that matches the bank's current template. I left the room before anyone could reorganize themselves around that sentence, and behind me I heard the scrape of chairs, Vivian's sharp intake of breath, and Grant saying too loudly, What the hell does that mean? They thought they had cornered me in a dining room full of polished wood and curated witnesses, but they had no idea they were standing in the first room of a much larger collapse. 3 months before that dinner, I had been in my office on the 22nd floor of Hale Capital's Midtown Tower, reviewing diligence notes for a logistics acquisition in Savannah, when I noticed the first irregularity. It wasn't dramatic. No smoking gun. No envelope left on my desk. Just a discrepancy in vendor timing that didn't make sense. Hale Capital was my father's crown jewel. Family office turned private investment firm turned sprawling holding company with interests in commercial real estate, regional transport, healthcare facilities, and municipal development contracts. He liked to call it a legacy platform. Everyone else called it what it was, a money machine with excellent tailoring. I had spent 12 years helping build it into something real. Not glamorous, real. I handled structure, risk review, dispute analysis, regulatory exposure. The unphotographed parts. The things that made the deals work after the ribbon cuttings and press releases. My father liked to play emperor in magazines. I was the one making sure the walls stayed up. The discrepancy sat in a packet from one of our development subsidiaries, Meridian Square Urban Partners. A consulting invoice had been backdated by 16 days. Harmless on its own, until I found 2 more. Then a vendor shell in Delaware tied to a project manager who had left the company 18 months earlier. Then a strategic advisory retainer that routed through a holding entity I had never seen on our approved vendor matrix. I stayed late that night. The tower was almost empty by 9:30. The glass walls of the conference rooms had gone dark, reflecting only the soft task lighting in the city outside. I took off my blazer, rolled up my sleeves, and started tracing payment authorizations. By midnight, I knew 2 things. First, someone inside Hale Capital was moving money through layered entities disguised as consulting expenses, retention packages, and land use facilitation fees. Second, the approvals attached to those disbursements were too senior to be an accident. I didn't go to my father. That surprises people when I tell the story. They hear financial misconduct and assume the obvious next step is disclosure up the chain. But if you grow up around men like Walter Hale, you learn early that hierarchy is not the same thing as safety. My father didn't raise children. He raised leverage. He had been charming when I was young. That was his best form. Smiling at fundraisers, teaching me how to shake hands without hesitating, bringing me into conference rooms as a teenager and calling me my sharp one in front of clients who liked the optics of a competent daughter. He taught me how to read cap tables before I was old enough to rent a car. He taught me that emotion was something other people used when they had no documentation. What he never taught me was trust. My mother, Elaine Foster Hale, had understood him better than anyone. She died when I was 23, and I lost not just a parent but the only person in that house who treated truth as something more valuable than advantage. My father remarried Vivian Mercer 2 years later. Vivian arrived in creams and cashmere and low, soothing tones, carrying a philanthropic resume and a gift for making cruelty sound like etiquette. Grant, who had always been impulsive, became worse under her attention. More entitled, more theatrical, more convinced that consequences were a design flaw in the universe. So no, I didn't go to my father. I did what I always did. I observed. Over the next 6 weeks, I built a private file map on an encrypted external drive I kept inside a document box labeled Tax Archives from 2018. I captured ledgers, approval chains, meeting metadata, version histories, parking garage camera pulls, and compliance escalations that had been opened, reassigned, then quietly closed. I took screenshots of Slack messages. I exported calendar invites. I copied wire forms and compared them across version edits. The more I saw, the clearer the structure became. Several development projects had been inflated through duplicate consulting contracts. A set of land acquisition entities had been used to shift funds before quarter close. A municipal bid in DeKalb County had unusual facilitation expenses that matched dates of closed-door meetings my father denied attending. And at the center of the web, over and over, was Grant. Not alone, never alone, but present. He wasn't smart enough to design the whole machine. He was reckless enough to expose it. I might have kept building quietly for longer if not for the meeting on June 11th. My father called an executive session in the North Boardroom on 23. Long walnut table, frosted glass walls, city light washed gray through a storm front, turning everyone's faces slightly colorless. He sat at the head of the table with Vivian beside him, though she held no formal role. Grant was to his right, wearing a slate suit and a look of studied boredom. Martin Kessler was there, as was our CFO, Dana Morales, and 2 outside directors from the family trust. I went in expecting discussion about the Savannah acquisition. Instead, my father slid a packet toward me. "Effective immediately," he said. "Your signatory authority is being revised." No explanation. Just a packet. Inside was a governance restructuring memo. My access over 3 key subsidiary accounts would be reduced. My board observer seat on Hale Development would be suspended pending role realignment. Grant would assume expanded authority over cross-entity cash movement. I looked at Dana. She didn't meet my eyes. "Why?" I asked. Grant answered before my father could. "Because this firm needs people who understand growth." My father steepled his fingers. "Because you've become obstructive." "Obstructive," I repeated. Vivian spoke softly, each word polished to a gleam. "You challenge process in ways that create instability." What they meant was I had started asking questions in writing. I flipped through the memo. It had been drafted the previous Friday. 2 of the directors had electronically signed the day before. Martin had prepared the language. Grant had already been copied on a revised authority schedule. This was not a discussion. It was an ambush with stationery. I closed the packet. "If you're redistributing authority," I said, "I assume legal and compliance reviewed the exposure on Meridian Square." Grant looked down too quickly. Vivian glanced at my father. And Dana, for one small fatal second, froze. That was when I knew the rod ran higher than I had hoped. My father smiled without warmth. "This is exactly the problem, Ava. Every issue becomes a moral exercise with you." "No," I said. "Only the illegal ones." Nobody spoke. My father's tone cooled further. "Be very careful." I looked back at him. "I am." That afternoon, I took the elevator down to the garage instead of back to my office. I sat in my car with the engine off and watched the rain stipple the windshield. Then I called the only person outside the family I trusted to tell me whether I was dealing with aggressive accounting or a criminal exposure wearing a tailored suit. Her name was Nora Whitcomb. Nora and I met during a regulatory dispute 8 years earlier when she was a federal prosecutor and I was the in-house executive everyone underestimated because I spoke softly and brought my own binders. She had since left government and joined a white-collar boutique called Whitcomb and Vale on Peachtree. Ruthless when necessary, exacting always. The kind of attorney who never wasted a word and never confused restraint with weakness. She answered on the second ring. "Ava, I need a privilege review," I said. Quietly. Her pause was brief. "How quiet?" "Quiet enough that if I'm right, my father can't hear the floorboard creak before it breaks." We met the next morning at 7:30 in a conference room with smoke glass partitions and leather chairs the color of dark tobacco. Outside, the city was still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Inside, Nora sat with a legal pad, a black coffee, and the kind of patience that makes guilty people tell on themselves. She listened for 40 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, she asked, "What do you want from this?" "Not revenge," I said. "Good. Control." That got the smallest lift of one eyebrow. I slid a flash drive across the glass table. "I want to know what they're doing, how exposed it is, how far it goes, and I want to know before they realize I know." Nora didn't touch the drive immediately. "If this turns into what I think it might, your first problem won't be the money. It'll be narrative. Men like your father survive because they decide, early and publicly, who the villain is." "I'm aware." She finally took the drive, then stopped reacting to them. Let them commit to a story. That became the architecture of everything that followed. For the next 2 months, I did less outwardly and more privately. I stopped challenging Grant in meetings. I allowed my reduced authority to remain reduced. I let Vivian think she had succeeded in isolating me. When my father excluded me from strategy dinners, I declined to protest. When Grant started copying me on sanitized summaries instead of primary documents, I thanked him. It unsettled them more than resistance would have. There is something profoundly irritating to manipulative people about calm. They want friction. They want visible pain. They want proof that their pressure is entering your bloodstream. When you give them none, they start improvising. Grant improvised first. He began dropping comments in meetings. Small ones. "Some people here don't understand scale. We can't let legacy thinking slow execution. Not everyone at the table is aligned with the family's long-term interests." It was the corporate version of leaving scratches on a locked door. Vivian escalated socially. She arranged 2 accidental exclusions at family events, then mentioned them within my hearing as if they were logistics errors. She started calling Celeste, the daughter I never had, at dinners whenever I was present. My Aunt Rebecca, never brave enough to oppose power directly, responded by becoming extra kind to me in private and conspicuously neutral in public. My father watched all of it with the distant satisfaction of a man who believed he was training the room. Then came a text. It was a Wednesday. Late. 11:42 p.m. "Dad, heard you've been complaining again. If you can't be loyal, at least be quiet." I read it while standing barefoot in my kitchen, the marble counter cool under my hand, the only light the pair of brass pendants over the island. I typed back, "I've asked questions." 3 dots appeared, vanished, appeared again. "Dad, questions are for people with options." That line would come back to me later. The real breakthrough arrived through someone nobody in my family had bothered to notice. Her name was Elena Ruiz. Elena worked in Treasury operations, title officially. Elena asked if she could speak to me after work one Thursday. Not in the office. Across the street at a place called Juniper Lane Cafe, where the tables were matte black stone and the windows caught the gold of late summer in long, slanting bands. She arrived with a canvas tote and a face set in that careful way people wear when they have already decided to do something dangerous. "I shouldn't be here," she said after we ordered. "Then why are you?" She took a breath. "Because I think they're going to blame you for something." I said nothing. She opened her tote and slid a slim accordion file onto the table. Inside were copies of internal exception tickets, beneficiary changes, routing confirmations, and after-hours credential resets. Several bore my name. The timestamps did not match my actual logins. One of the tickets had been submitted by an admin credential linked to Dana Morales' office. Another had been approved under Martin Kessler's legal override authority. I turned one page at a time. Where did you get these? I pulled the exception queue history before it was scrubbed. Why? Elena looked down at her coffee, then back at me. Because Grant asked me to backfill a transfer trail last month and told me not to overthink the formatting. Then he invited me to drinks and spent 20 minutes explaining how loyalty gets rewarded at Hale Capital. She smiled once, without humor. I don't like men who think everyone has a price because they do. That was the first time I nearly laughed during the entire ordeal. Who else knows you have this? No one. Nora met Elena 48 hours later in a privileged room at Whitcomb and Vale. By then we had already confirmed that someone had been building a paper trail meant to support a future internal theft allegation against me. Not just one forged item. A sequence. Login anomalies. Beneficiary edits. Draft wire approvals seeded into the system under my credentials. It was sloppy in some places and frighteningly coordinated in others. Nora spread the documents across a conference table and moved through them with a capped pen. Here's what they believed, she said. They believed they had time. They believed you'd panic. And they believed everyone in the room would rather preserve proximity to power than ask whether the story made sense. So we let them finish, I said. Nora looked at me for a long second. We let them overcommit. The next few weeks were procedural and precise. We filed nothing. Confronted no one. Instead, we documented everything. Nora brought in a forensic accountant named Elias Voss from a firm in Charlotte. Tall, angular, glasses that slid down his nose when he read, and a habit of speaking in bullet points even in casual conversation. He reconstructed the transaction chains across 11 entities and 3 banking relationships. He identified repeated round dollar patterns hidden inside layered fees. He found that the LLC supposedly added as a beneficiary on my transfer, Northmere Advisory Group, was controlled through a registered agent connected to one of Grant's college friends, Trevor Lynn. Trevor had no actual advisory business. He had a condo in Miami and a social feed full of boats he didn't own. Elena helped us map internal system access. Dana Morales, the CFO, wasn't architecting the entire scheme, but she had approved enough exception behavior to hang herself professionally if this surfaced. Martin Kessler's involvement was subtler. Legal overrides, retrospective memo cleanups, language crafted to make backdated approvals look administrative instead of intentional. And then there was Celeste. I hadn't planned for Celeste. If you had asked me that spring what I thought of my half-brother's fiancée, I would have said she was polished, image-conscious, and dangerously willing to confuse proximity to wealth with character. She had one of those faces magazines describe as luminous and a talent for appearing harmless while calculating the social geometry of every room she entered. But on August 3rd, Celeste called me from a private number and asked if we could meet. We met at an art museum cafe on a Tuesday afternoon while summer heat pressed itself against the glass. She wore cream silk, no engagement ring, and held her iced tea with both hands as if studying them. I know you don't like me, she said. I don't know you well enough to dislike you. She let out a breath. Fair. I waited. Her eyes moved to the sculpture garden outside, then back to me. Grant used your laptop once. That got my attention. When? Late May. At the lake house. You were out with Rebecca getting wine for dinner. He said he needed to print something, and yours was already open in the study. It times out after 3 minutes. She swallowed. Then maybe it didn't that night. I said nothing. He was angry, she continued. He kept saying your name. Said Dad needed proof you were unstable. Said you were making everything difficult. I thought he was just being dramatic. Her mouth tightened. Then 2 weeks later I heard him on speaker with Martin. They were talking about credential continuity, and if she denies it will have the log path. Why are you telling me this now? She looked embarrassed by the answer. Because I finally understood what kind of family I was marrying into. And because last Friday Grant got drunk and said, by the time this hits, Ava won't even know which way is up. The answer sat between us for a moment. Why not go to the police? She asked. Because right now they still think I'm isolated. She stared at me. You already have a plan. Yes. A slow, almost incredulous expression crossed her face. My God! You can still marry him, I said. She laughed once, brittle and disbelieving. Absolutely not. Celeste didn't become my friend that day. People confuse alliance with intimacy. They are not the same thing. She became something more useful, a witness with motive to defect. Grant had cheated on her repeatedly, promised equity he couldn't legally give, used her trust fund connections to fish for investors while mocking her to his friends in private messages she later showed Nora. By the time she came to me, she wasn't protecting me. She was protecting herself from becoming collateral damage in a family she finally recognized as predatory. Nora's view was clinical. She's credible if corroborated, valuable if careful, dangerous if emotional. Celeste, to her credit, was not emotional. Not once she decided to leave. She gave us screenshots, audio, 2 forwarded emails, and one detail so specific it changed the entire frame of the case. The forged transfer, discovery, had been timed for the Caraway House dinner because Vivian wanted the confrontation to happen in front of Rebecca, Celeste, and Martin, so the family version is set before Ava can scramble. That line came from a voice memo Celeste had accidentally captured at her engagement dress fitting when Vivian took a call in the adjoining lounge and didn't realize Celeste's phone was recording in her handbag. That was the moment I knew Act 1 of their story exactly as they intended to stage it, so I let them. The week before the dinner, my father's messages sharpened. Dad, you've become impossible to defend. Dad, if there's anything you want to explain before things become formal, now is the time. Dad, I'm hearing ugly things. I replied to none of them. Then, 4 hours before the dinner, the final text arrived. Dad, you're selfish and dead to me. I was in my apartment when it came through. Early evening. Rain streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline blurred in silver and charcoal beyond the glass. I read the words once, then set the phone down beside my keys. Nora, who was sitting at my dining table reviewing a draft chronology, looked up. Bad. I handed her the phone. She read it. Her mouth flattened. He's committing to the narrative. Yes. You okay? I picked up the phone and typed one word. Okay. Then I locked the screen and turned it face down. Nora watched me for a second. You realize he'll think that means surrender. I know. What are you going to do after dinner? I looked at the city lights starting to appear, one by one beyond the rain. Withdraw every dollar they no longer have a legal right to control. To understand that sentence, you need to understand the structure. There were 3 pots of money around which my family had built half its private mythology. The first was Hale Capital Operating Liquidity, which I could not and did not touch. The second was the Hale Family Trust, over which my father held primary authority, and which was tied up in layers of governance and fiduciary obligations. The third was something called the Foster Hale Preservation Fund. That fund had been created by my mother's family after the sale of Foster Biologics, the company my grandfather built before he died. My mother's inheritance had gone into a separately papered asset vehicle protected under a post-nuptial restructuring after my father nearly blew through part of his liquidity in a real estate crunch during my adolescence. On paper, the fund existed for family continuity, educational support, and intergenerational stabilization. In reality, it was my mother's insurance policy against my father ever controlling everything. What Walter Hale never quite forgave her for was the signature sequence. The fund required 2 trustees to authorize disbursements, my father as administrative trustee, and me as successor protective trustee after my 25th birthday. He had day-to-day visibility, but not unilateral extraction, rights over principal beyond a narrow management band. If a triggering event occurred involving family disinheritance, coercive exclusion, or a documented attempt to strip a beneficiary of standing through bad faith conduct, the protective trustee could suspend joint administration and transfer the fund into independent management under a designated outside fiduciary. Most people in my family either didn't know that clause existed or had convinced themselves it would never matter. My mother had insisted it remain buried in an amended exhibit to the trust governance memo. I knew because she had once sat at the edge of my bed when I was 24, handed me a thick envelope and said, "If your father ever confuses authority with ownership, read page 17 first." I still had the envelope, cream paper, her handwriting. After his dead-to-me text, the triggering event was no longer hypothetical. But I didn't move immediately. Timing matters. Not legally. Narratively. I went to the dinner. I let them accuse me. I let witnesses hear his words. I preserved the confrontation. Then I left. At 9:42 p.m., I was in the back of a town car heading south on Peachtree, city lights sliding across the glass. Nora sat beside me. Elias Voss was on speaker. And on my lap was a leather folio containing the relevant trust documents, the trigger memorandum, my mother's letter, and a prepared notice to First Harbor Fiduciary Services. I called the number printed on the fund's fiduciary backup writer. It routed to an after-hours escalation desk. "This is Ava Elaine Hale," I said when the operator answered. "I need to initiate a protective trustee suspension under the Foster Hale Preservation Fund. Trigger event documentation is ready. Outside counsel is copied. I will be emailing and delivering originals tonight." There was a procedural pause. Verification. Security questions. Pin phrase. Document codes. Nora answered the legal confirmation requests. Elias confirmed the attached chronology and forensic findings sufficient to establish bad faith family coercion surrounding beneficiary standing. The operator patched in the on-call trust officer, a man named Stephen Merritt, whose voice carried the flattened alertness of someone pulled into a problem much larger than anticipated. "Ms. Hale," he said, "if the documents support what you're representing, we can freeze administrative movement and transition management before market open." "They do. Do you want a full suspension?" "Yes." "Do you want disbursement control shifted to independent custody?" "Yes." He exhaled softly. "All right." By 11:18 p.m., the notice had been transmitted, acknowledged, and flagged for emergency review. By 8:05 the next morning, the fund, every liquid dollar my father liked to imply was family money, was no longer under his practical reach. He texted me at 8:17. "Dad, what did you do?" I was sitting in Nora's conference room under soft recessed light, reading the acknowledgement letter on heavy cream stationery. I wrote back. I protected my mother's assets. His response came instantly. "Dad, you have no authority to touch that fund." I looked across the table at Nora, then at the signed suspension confirmation. I typed, "That's not what the documents say." He called. I declined. Then Vivian called. Then Grant. Then Martin. I let each of them ring out until Martin left a voicemail trying to sound formal and failing. "Ava, this needs to be reversed immediately. There's been a serious overstep. Call me back before noon." Nora played it twice, then set her phone down. Now they're frantic. I took another sip of coffee. "Good," I said. By early afternoon, the first reversal had widened into 3. The forged transfer evidence my father had used at dinner was defective on its face. The internal logs supposedly showing my credentials had been backfilled from 2 administrative override paths, and the fund he believed he could threaten me with was no longer under his control. At 2:06 p.m., I received an email from Whitcomb and Vale's litigation support team containing a side-by-side comparison of the evidence Martin had shown at dinner and the actual bank template from the same date range. Header mismatch, footer mismatch, missing disclosure language, incorrect routing sequence, enough to shred credibility before anyone reached motive. At 3:14 p.m., Elena sent a secure message. "Dana has been asking who pulled historical exception tickets. Grant is yelling on 23. Vivian came in wearing sunglasses. Martin closed his office door." At 4:02 p.m., Celeste forwarded me a text from Grant. "Don't talk to anyone. This is a family issue." At 4:05 p.m., she sent a second screenshot. "Already did." That evening my father finally reached me through a number I didn't recognize. His voice was low and controlled, which meant he was furious enough to be careful. "You've made a catastrophic mistake." "No," I said. "I documented one. You're playing with assets you don't understand. I understand them better than you do. You think outside counsel can save you from this. I don't need saving." A pause. Then, colder. "If you go public with any of this, you destroy the family." I looked at the city through the conference room glass, at my own reflection looking back. "You should have thought about that before manufacturing evidence." His breath caught, just once. "There's no evidence of that." I let the silence settle. Then I said quietly, "Actually, there is. Quite a lot." That was the sentence that took the room from fear to panic. Because by then he wasn't in a room alone. I could hear movement on his end. Shoes. A door. Vivian asking something sharply in the background. Grant's voice louder, trying to sound in control. My father lowered his voice. What do you want? Tomorrow, I said. 11 o'clock. Whitcomb and Vale. Bring your own counsel if you're smart. He laughed once, harsh and empty. You don't get to summon me. No, I replied, but the federal regulators eventually will. I thought I'd offer you a quieter room first. I ended the call before he could recover. Nora had been leaning against the conference table the whole time, arms folded. You enjoy this less than most people would? I'm not enjoying it at all. Good, she said. It keeps you accurate. The next morning, before they arrived, I stood by the window in Nora's office with a glass of cold water and watched a delivery truck back into the alley below. Atlanta was bright and sharp after rain, sunlight flashing off glass towers and the chrome trim of parked cars. I took one slow sip while Nora reviewed the agenda for the meeting. No theatrics. No bluffing. Just sequence. First, challenge the authenticity of a supposed theft evidence. Second, present the internal manipulation trail. Third, disclose the trust suspension and its trigger basis. Fourth, introduce cooperating witnesses if necessary. Fifth, offer structured resolution before referral. They think this is a family argument, Nora said. Make sure they leave understanding it's an evidentiary problem. At 10:58, my father arrived with Martin Kessler and a new attorney from Shaw Barrick LLP, a white-collar partner named Allison Price whose expression suggested she had been given partial facts by dishonest people in a hurry. Vivian came too, though she had no legal reason to be there. Grant trailed behind them in a charcoal suit, jaw tight, phone in hand. Dana Morales arrived 3 minutes later looking as if she had not slept. Celeste did not come. She didn't need to. Her materials were already in Nora's possession. Whitcomb and Vale's main conference room was deliberately austere. Long table in dark wood, high-backed leather chairs, abstract artwork with too much white space. The kind of room built to make loose talk sound expensive. On the credenza behind Nora were 3 labeled binders, 2 banker's boxes, and a monitor already connected to a presentation deck Elias had prepared. The boardroom gleamed like a museum built for money. My father noticed the binders first. Vivian noticed me. Grant noticed the monitor. Dana noticed the boxes and nearly stopped walking. Nobody looked at one another the way they had at Caraway House. No one was reclining now. No one was smiling for effect. Even Vivian's posture had changed. Her shoulders, usually set back in practiced elegance, seemed narrower somehow. Grant took his chair too fast and had to adjust it twice. Nora began without preamble. This meeting is being conducted under settlement privilege. My client has not yet made external referrals regarding the matters at issue, but she is prepared to do so. Today is an opportunity to address evidence before those options narrow. Allison Price turned slightly toward my father, just enough to signal that she was now actively reassessing whatever story she had been told. Martin folded his hands. We're here because your client improperly interfered with a family trust. Nora nodded once. We'll get there. She motioned to Elias. Elias stood, pressed a key on the remote, and the screen illuminated with a title slide, transaction pathways and credential manipulation timeline. Under it, small and precise, were date ranges covering 4 months. Grant let out a short, incredulous laugh. This is insane. Elias ignored him. Item 1, he said. The alleged unauthorized transfer attributed to Ms. Hale. The document displayed at Caraway House on September 14th does not match First Harbor Private Bank's operative confirmation template. Exhibit 1A. The screen split. On the left, the screenshot from dinner. On the right, an authenticated bank form obtained through counsel. Even to a layperson, the differences were obvious. Footer language, routing placement, advisory disclaimer, timestamp formatting. Allison Price leaned forward. Martin did not. Elias clicked again. Item 2. The login activity purporting to show Ms. Hale's authorization path was generated through after-hours administrative override tickets linked to internal service credentials. Those credentials route to an approval chain involving Treasury exception management and legal compliance override. Exhibit 2C. This time the screen showed access logs, highlighted and cross-referenced. Dana's face drained as if someone had pulled a plug. Item 3. Elias continued. The beneficiary amendment adding Northmere Advisory Group to the disbursement path was created from an internal template library and pushed through version history after the effective date appearing on the document. The registered entity itself is controlled through a nominee relationship tied to Trevor Lynn, who has personal and historical ties to Grant Hale. Exhibit 3F. Grant's chair made a small noise against the floor. This is garbage. Elias clicked again. Item 4. Repeated transfer layering across Meridian's Square Urban Partners, Ravenshore Land Assemblage, and Carter Municipal Development reveals a round dollar skimming pattern inconsistent with ordinary consulting expense behavior. Total identified exposure to date, $8.6 million. My father's head turned sharply toward Dana. She whispered, "That number isn't." Elias interrupted with professional calm. "Documented." The room's energy skittered from person to person like a live wire. Nora stepped in. "We can continue by project, by entity, or by individual role. My preference is individual role. It tends to focus people." Vivian found her voice first. "This is extortion." "No," Nora said. "It's chronology." She tapped the first binder. September 14th was not the beginning of this. June 11th was not the beginning either. We have evidence going back to late spring showing a coordinated effort to reduce Ms. Hale's authority, seed a false credential trail, and prepare her as the internal scapegoat if the underlying financial irregularities surfaced. Allison Price turned fully toward my father now. "Walter, is that accurate?" He didn't answer immediately. "This is a hostile interpretation of internal governance." Nora slid a document across the table. It was the trust suspension notice. "Then let's discuss why. After texting my client, 'You're selfish and dead to me,' you attempted to use a public family confrontation to discredit her standing before she exercised a protective trustee clause you either forgot existed or hoped she had." Vivian went very still. Martin finally lost his composure. "You had no right to access private communications." Nora looked at him. She was the recipient. I opened my own folder then and took out a single cream envelope, softened at the edges with age. My mother's handwriting on the front. "Ava." I placed it on the table but did not open it. "My mother made me protective trustee when I turned 25, I said. "She included a trigger clause for coercive exclusion, bad faith disinheritance, and reputational manipulation aimed at forcing beneficiary surrender. Last Thursday, my father supplied written evidence that the clause was needed. Friday night, he supplied witnesses. Grant stared at me. "You planned this." I met his eyes. "No. I prepared for you." He shook his head hard, once, as if motion itself could clear the facts. "You psycho." "Grant," Allison Price snapped. It was the first moment anyone on their side sounded truly alarmed. Nora nodded to the second monitor. "We're not finished." Next came a timeline. Elias displayed it by date and entity, each line clean and devastating. May 22nd. Unauthorized use of Ava Hale's open workstation at the Lake House study, corroborated by witness statement. May 29th. Service credential continuity discussion between Grant Hale and Martin Kessler referencing log path. June 11th. Governance restructuring reducing Ava Hale's authority over entities later used in transaction layering. June 18th through August 26th. Repeated Treasury exception tickets, several backfilled after hours, mapped to Dana Morales' office credential chain. July 7th. Northmere Advisory Group formation through nominee agent linked to Trevor Lynn. August 3rd. Recorded statement by Vivian Hale referencing need to set the family version before Ava can scramble. September 14th. Staged family accusation at Caraway House using defective forged transfer screenshot. September 14th, 11:18 p.m. Emergency trustee suspension initiated pursuant to trigger clause. Each date landed with the dull certainty of a nail-driven straight. My father's confidence cracked like thin ice. He turned to Martin. "Did you tell them about the memo?" Martin's answer was too slow. "Which memo?" "The contingency memo." Nora lifted the third binder. "This one." She opened it to a tab section and slid a copy toward Allison Price. I watched her skim the first page, then the second, then stop. "What is this?" she asked, voice suddenly flat. Martin looked sick. "Draft strategy language." "It says," Allison replied, eyes on the page, If Ava contests internal discipline, position conduct as emotional retaliation related to family role displacement. Nobody spoke. Then Grant said, too loudly, "That wasn't even my wording." Dana turned on him. "Oh my God!" And there it was. The fracture. He looked at her. "Don't start. Don't start," she hissed. "You told me legal had everything covered." Martin snapped. "Dana, be quiet." She stared at him in disbelief. "You told me it was a temporary patch until the quarter closed." Vivian's head turned sharply. "Dana, what exactly did you approve?" The room tipped. Grant shoved back from the table. "This is unbelievable. Dad, say something." My father kept his hands clasped too tightly in front of him. "Sit down." No, I'm not taking this alone." Allison Price closed the binder with precise force. "You may not have a choice." Nora nodded toward me. It was my turn. I had spent years in rooms where men confused volume with force. I had learned long ago that the surest way to own a room was to refuse its tempo. So I spoke slowly. "I knew you were building something around my name the moment you changed my authority and stopped copying me on primary approvals," I said. "I knew Grant was too arrogant to keep his hands clean. I knew Martin would choose the version of events most likely to protect the firm, not the truth. And I knew Vivian would try to make the first confrontation social, not legal, because she understands audience better than evidence." Vivian's mouth parted. Just slightly. I went on. "So I made sure you'd find exactly what you wanted to find." Grant blinked. "What?" "The silence. The withdrawal. The reduced resistance. I wanted you comfortable." He stared at me. "I wanted you to see them," I said quietly, looking at Allison now, then Dana, then back at my father. "I wanted everyone to see how confident you were when you believed I had no witnesses." My father's jaw moved once. Allison set both palms on the table. "I need a private conference with my clients." Nora didn't move. In a moment, she slid one final folder forward. "This contains a witness statement and corroborating materials from someone your side assumed was aligned with you." Grant looked at it, then at me, and something like dread crossed his face for the first time. "From who?" he asked. I didn't answer. Nora did. "Celeste Warren." Grant went white. Vivian turned so fast her chair creaked. "Celeste." Nora opened the folder and read, not theatrically, just clearly. Grant's use of Ava's workstation. Martin on speaker discussing log continuity. Vivian's recorded statement about setting the family version. Grant's text directing Celeste not to speak to anyone. Supporting screenshots attached. Time metadata preserved. "No," Grant said. "No, she's lying. She's pissed because we broke up." Nora looked up. She ended the engagement. Dana made a small sound I can only describe as exhausted disgust. My father's voice was very low. "Why would she do this?" "Because," I said. "Next time, make sure the people listening to you aren't also listening to themselves." It was not the only reason Celeste switched sides, but it was the cleanest one. Men like Grant assume betrayal is emotional. Often it is observational. The room dissolved after that. Grant demanded his own lawyer. Dana said she wanted separate counsel too. Vivian insisted she had nothing to do with operational documents, which was technically true and narratively useless. Martin tried twice to regain control by recharacterizing everything as internal procedural confusion before Allison cut him off so sharply he actually fell silent. My father sat through all of it without raising his voice again. That was how I knew he understood the scale. Anger was still useful when he thought force could restore shape to the room. Silence meant he had moved into calculation. Finally, Allison asked the only question that mattered. "What is your client asking for?" Nora had prepared the term sheet. 10 pages. Clean. Surgical. Independent forensic review at company expense. Immediate separation of Grant from all operational and governance roles. Martin's resignation as company counsel. Dana's leave pending review and full cooperation. Written retraction of allegations against me. Restoration of my professional standing and compensation, but not my return to day-to-day operations unless I chose it. Permanent independent administration of the Foster Hale Preservation Fund. Carve out settlement payment from non-fund personal distributions. Non-disparagement backed by injunctive relief. Preservation of all relevant electronically stored information. And if any term was breached, immediate referral packages would go to the appropriate civil and criminal authorities. Vivian looked appalled. This is annihilation. No, I said evenly. This is containment. Grant laughed in disbelief. You think Dad's going to sign this? My father turned to him, then with a look I had seen only a handful of times in my life. It was the expression he wore when a deal had gone bad, and he had decided which part of it he could still salvage. Stop talking, he said. Grant stopped. The private conference lasted 43 minutes. Nora and I stayed in the outer office, while their side moved into the secondary room down the hall. Through the glass, I could see only fragments. Allison standing, Martin pacing, Vivian sitting rigid with both hands in her lap, Dana bent forward, elbows on knees, Grant moving too much, my father motionless except for one hand along the arm of his chair. I poured myself water from a carafe on the sideboard. Nora reviewed 2 possible modifications to the settlement language. Outside, late afternoon light had turned the opposite tower gold. Are you all right? She asked. Yes. You don't have to be iron every second. I know. She studied me. Then what are you feeling? I thought about the question before answering. Accurate, I said. That made her smile. When they returned, they were rearranged. Grant didn't look at anyone. Dana looked only at Allison. Vivian looked at my father with the wary incomprehension of someone realizing the room was no longer obeying the script she had rehearsed. Martin's tie had shifted off-center. Allison spoke for them. They will agree in principle, subject to narrowing language on scope of external referral and mutual confidentiality. Nora shook her head. Not mutual. My client was falsely accused in front of witnesses. She is not being muzzled to preserve their comfort. My father finally spoke, voice scraped raw at the edges. Ava! I turned to him. He chose his words carefully now, each one expensive. If we do this, it ends here. I held his gaze. It ends where the documents say it ends. He looked at me for several seconds, perhaps hoping to find the daughter he could still manipulate if he reached the right tone. The dutiful one. The one who once believed earning respect and receiving it were related. She was not in that room. He nodded once. Fine. The signing took another hour. Initials on each page. Full signatures on the last. Council counter-signatures. Preservation notices issued. A follow-up calendar locked. Dana signed her cooperation acknowledgement with a hand that shook only once. Martin signed his resignation term with the pinched fury of a man calculating the invoices he would never send. Grant refused until Allison told him, in a voice stripped of all patience, that refusal would not protect him from the existing record and would almost certainly worsen his position. He signed then, slamming the pen down afterward as if childish force might restore dignity. Vivian signed last among them. She removed one of her rings before taking the pen, as though even then she was curating the image of her hand. When she finished, she looked at me with eyes I had once mistaken for kindness. I welcomed you as my own, she said softly. It was such an expertly chosen lie that for a moment I almost admired it. No, I said. You welcomed the version of me that didn't interrupt you. She looked away first. My father was the last signature on the controlling line. He read the final page himself, instead of relying on counsel. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint click of the HVAC and the dry whisper of paper shifting under his wrist. He signed, capped the pen, and placed it on the table with measured care. When he rose, everyone else did too, some from instinct, some from discomfort. He looked older standing than he had seated. Not frail. Never that. Just less inevitable. You've made your point, he said. I stood as well. This was the moment people imagine should feel triumphant. The enemy fallen. The room reversed. The long-awaited humiliation answered. What I felt instead was clarity. You taught me very early, I said. That paperwork matters more than promises. He stared at me. So I learned. Then I picked up my mother's envelope, slipped it back into my folio and added, You should have read page 17. I left the boardroom before anyone found a response worth giving. The next few days moved with a strange, compressed speed that follows a private catastrophe in public clothing. Hale Capital issued no press release, of course. Families like mine rarely announce implosions. They rename them transitions. Within 72 hours, Martin Kessler was stepping away to pursue other opportunities. Grant was on temporary leave pending strategic restructuring. Dana Morales had retained separate counsel and begun limited cooperation through attorneys. Vivian withdrew from 2 charity boards to focus on family matters. And my father, who had spent decades confusing stage management with permanence, stopped returning certain calls. Because there were calls. Institutional ones, banking ones, board ones, quiet inquiries from people who had heard enough to understand that something serious had happened but not enough to know which side of it would survive. Nora handled what needed handling. Elias continued his review. Preservation, letters multiplied. A second set of internal anomalies surfaced. Once frightened mid-level employees realized the sky had already cracked. Then, 4 weeks later, the first agreement was finalized into a broader separation package. I did not return to Hale Capital. That surprised my Aunt Rebecca more than anyone. She invited me to lunch at a small French place in Inman Park, where the tabletops were white marble and the windows threw autumn light across brass fixtures and cut-glass water tumblers. Rebecca had always loved expensive lunches with the tone of confessionals. She arrived in dove-gray silk, kissed my cheek, and held my hand for a moment longer than usual. "I assumed," she said after the waiter left, "that once you had control, you'd take your place." "My place where?" "At the firm." I looked out at the street for a second. Leaves moving along the curb. A cyclist gliding past. The ordinary world continuing without permission. I didn't do all that to inherit a contaminated building. Rebecca absorbed that, then nodded slowly. "What will you do?" "At the moment," I said, "I'm having lunch." She smiled despite herself. Your mother would have loved that answer. I smiled back, because that was true. 6 months later, my mornings looked nothing like they had before. I moved out of the condo my father had once described as a smart city asset and into a renovated brick building on the edge of Old Fourth Ward. The apartment had tall windows, pale oak floors, matte black fixtures, and a balcony that caught sunrise over the city in a clean wash of gold. The first morning I woke there, I stood barefoot in the kitchen wearing one of my oldest sweatshirts and brewed coffee in a steel French press, while sunlight poured across the counter like warm honey. There is a particular kind of silence that only arrives after survival. Not emptiness, not loneliness, just the absence of being watched for weakness. I learned to like it. I bought a wide ceramic mug from a local potter, blue-gray glaze, slightly uneven at the lip. I started opening the balcony door even when the air was cold. I filled the shelves with files of my own, rather than files I was cleaning up for men who mistook extraction for leadership. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. By then the karmic accounting had begun to settle around each of them with a precision I would have found almost literary if I hadn't lived it. My father lost more than money, though money certainly hurt. The Foster Hale Preservation Fund remained permanently under independent administration. He never regained practical control over it. Several investors in adjacent side vehicles quietly reduced exposure once governance questions began circulating. 2 board members resigned within the quarter. A municipal development committee in DeKalb chose not to renew one of the consortium partnerships most closely associated with his name. No indictment arrived, and I won't pretend one did. Real life is often less cinematic than people want. But he lost what mattered most to him: inevitability. Rooms no longer tilted automatically in his direction. People began asking for things in writing. Vivian's consequences were subtler and, to her, probably worse. She survived legally. She had insulated herself from operational signatures, well enough for that. But socially, the woman who curated family image as if it were a museum collection found herself cut by the very ecosystem she had spent years cultivating. Invitations slowed, then thinned, then took on the faint, performative. Without the firm title, the car allowance, the implied future, and the glow of Walter Hale's open favor, he was just a reckless man in expensive shoes with terrible habits, and a documented history of leaning on other people's work. He tried a short-lived advisory venture with 2 former fraternity contacts. It lasted 11 weeks. Then there was a rumor about margin debt, a loud argument at a members' club in Buckhead, and finally a minor but humiliating item in a local business gossip column describing him as formerly associated with Hale Capital, which is rich people language for exiled. Dana Morales cooperated enough to keep her life from truly detonating, but her career as she had known it was over. CFO roles at reputable firms do not go to executives whose names appear in connection with manipulated approval trails, even if they insist they were merely smoothing quarter-end irregularities under pressure. She relocated to Charlotte and, last I heard, was doing consulting no one would ever put in a press release. Martin Kessler lost the kind of thing men like him build entire personalities around: institutional respectability. Not all at once, just by degrees. A partnership reconsidered, a committee seat not renewed, referrals quietly redirected elsewhere. The formal explanation was fatigue, transition, market realignment. The real explanation was that sophisticated clients do not enjoy discovering their lawyer helped draft contingency language positioning an innocent executive as emotionally unstable in case fraud surfaced. And Celeste, perhaps to everyone's surprise except mine, did just fine. She moved to Charleston for a while, returned the ring through counsel, and launched an events consultancy that turned out to be much more substantial than anyone in my family had assumed she was capable of. The people who underestimate women because they look decorative are often doing half the other woman's work for her. The messages from my family came in waves. At first, anger. Dad, reverse the independent administration. You've made your point. Grant, hope you enjoy being alone. Vivian, family survive by choosing grace. Then bargaining. Dad, we can discuss a path forward if you stop listening to your lawyers. Vivian, Rebecca is heartbroken. This doesn't have to be permanent. Grant, can you at least tell people I wasn't involved in the accounting side? Then, eventually, the soft-focused nostalgia manipulative people deploy when force stops working. Dad, I miss your mother too. Vivian, the holidays won't feel the same. Dad, the family isn't the same without you. I archived every one of them. I did not respond. His old messages sat in the archive like bones at the bottom of a lake. That may sound cold to people who have never had to choose between blood and self-respect. It didn't feel cold to me. It felt hygienic. The strangest part of Aftermath is how quickly new structures emerge if you let them. What I discovered during the entire ordeal was that I was very good at one specific thing I had spent years undervaluing because my father treated it as support work, unraveling institutional deception before it hardened into public truth. So I built a business around it, not revenge consulting. Not crisis PR, something narrower and more useful. Whitcomb Strategic Advisory began in one borrowed office at the back of Nora's suite, 2 desks, a glass wall, and a used espresso machine that hissed like it resented employment. I specialized in governance risk, internal evidence mapping, and pre-litigation narrative control for founders, family offices, nonprofit boards, and executives who had suddenly realized that we'll handle it internally often means we hope nobody competent is documenting this. Nora handled legal matters. I handled structure, chronology, exposure mapping, internal fracture points, and the one thing almost everyone gets wrong when panic hits: sequencing. Within 4 months, I had more work than I expected. By month 7, I hired Elena. She came in on a rainy Monday, carrying the same canvas tote I'd first seen at Juniper Lane Cafe, and stood in my new office. Warm walnut shells, brushed steel lamp, a rug in muted navy and rust, looking both proud and slightly overwhelmed. "You're sure?" she said, glancing around. "Yes. You know I've never done this kind of role before." "You already did," I said. "You just weren't being paid like it." Her laugh filled the room in a way I hadn't heard from her before. It made me absurdly happy. We celebrated with takeout Thai eaten from cartons at the conference table while autumn rain blurred the windows. There are victories that feel loud in public. This one felt better. Small. Specific. Built. A few friendships survived the fire. Rebecca, surprisingly, became one of them in a more honest way than she had ever managed while my father still controlled the center of gravity. She started calling without agenda. Sometimes just to ask if I tried a new place, or to tell me she had found an old photograph of my mother in college. We weren't suddenly saints in a movie. We were 2 women adjusting to what truth costs in a family organized around avoidance. Nora, of course, remained Nora, which is to say impossible to sentimentalize and entirely dependable. We developed the kind of friendship that grows out of professional respect and repeated proximity to absurdity. Once a month we had dinner somewhere dimly lit and expensive enough to discourage interruptions, and she let herself be funny in the dry, lethal way only a deeply competent person can. The karma updates usually came from her. One Thursday evening, About 8 months after the settlement, we were seated in a booth at a place called Ledger and Pine. Dark green leather, brass railings, candlelight catching in the beveled edge of the water glasses. I had just finished telling her about a non-profit board chair who tried to delete Slack threads after threatening her own treasurer in writing when Nora lifted one brow and said, "You won't believe who I just saw." "Who?" "Grant. At Fulton Supply." I smiled over my wine. "Doing what?" "Trying to impress a woman who was visibly Googling him under the table." That got an actual laugh out of me. Nora lifted her glass. "He's using private investor now. Technically not untrue. Anyone can privately lose money." She nearly smiled. "I knew I kept you for a reason." A month later, Rebecca contributed another. We were walking through the Saturday farmers market near my neighborhood, canvas bags in hand, sunlight flashing on metal stands and jars of honey, when she leaned closer and said, "Have you heard? Vivian tried to host a donor lunch at the club, and only 6 women came. 6 is still a lunch. Not when she invited 32. I turned to look at her. "Rebecca." "What?" she said, not sorry at all. "I'm trying to be supportive. Support can look many ways." My father tried one final direct contact, nearly a year after Caraway House. It was a voicemail. No anger this time. No strategy. Just fatigue wearing the clothes of dignity. "Ava, I know you won't call back. I'm not asking you to. I only wanted to say that families break in ways no one intends. If there was fault on my side, and perhaps there was, I regret that it came to this." I listened to it once while standing by my office window at dusk, the city outside washed in pale blue fading to silver. Then I saved it to the archive beside everything else. The thing about men who spend their lives directing traffic around accountability is that when it finally reaches them, they often try to rename it tragedy. Sometimes it is not tragedy. Sometimes it is bookkeeping. That evening, about 14 months after the night he texted that I was dead to him, I found myself on a rooftop terrace in Charleston with a woman I never expected to share a drink with. Celeste had invited me down for the weekend after a conference I was already attending. Her consultancy had taken off. Mine had too. We had not become best friends or sisters in trauma or any other sentimental nonsense people assign women after conflict. What we became was more interesting. 2 people who had once stood on opposite edges of the same controlled narrative and then chosen not to stay there. The terrace overlooked the harbor. The sun was lowering in a dense orange wash, turning the water into hammered copper. Wicker chairs, linen cushions, a low glass table with a sweating bottle of sparkling water between us. Somewhere below, silverware chimed and someone laughed. The sunset laid an orange ribbon across the skyline. Celeste handed me a glass. "To terrible men with excellent tailoring." I took it from her. "That sounds too generous." She grinned. "Fair. To surviving them." We touched glasses. There was something almost absurdly gentle about the moment, her bare feet tucked under her chair, my blazer folded over the armrest. The salt in the air, the fact that once upon a time she had been the glittering appendage on Grant's arm at family events, while I dismissed her as superficial and she dismissed me as cold. We had both been wrong in ways that now seemed almost affectionate. "Do you ever think," she asked, looking out over the water, "about how close I came to marrying him?" "Yes," I said. "Usually when I want to improve my mood." She laughed, full and unguarded. Then she grew quiet. "I was stupid," she said. "No," I replied. "You were flattered. It's different." She turned that over. "And you?" "I was trained," I said. We sat with that. Below us, the city shifted into evening. Warm light in restaurant windows. Slow traffic. The first signs flickering on. The city lights came on like constellations learning my name. I thought about who I had been before all of this. Efficient. Capable. Careful. Loyal long past the point of wisdom. I had mistaken endurance for virtue. Mistaken being indispensable for being safe. Mistaken my father's occasional approval for a relationship that existed outside performance. I don't despise that version of me. She was not foolish, just unfinished. The woman I became on the other side was quieter in some ways and less willing in others. Less interested in being understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. Less impressed by authority presented without ethics. More patient, more exact, more at home in the knowledge that composure is not passivity and distance is not cruelty. There is a specific freedom and no longer auditioning for love you should not have to earn. Celeste topped off our glasses. "Do you ever hate them?" she asked. I considered the question honestly. "No," I said. "I'm too busy using what they taught me." That was true in more ways than one. Because in the end, the thing that still surprises me is gratitude. Not for what they did, never that, but for what it clarified. My father, Vivian, Grant, all of them, forced a reckoning I might otherwise have delayed for years. They took the architecture of my old life and stressed it hard enough to reveal which beams were rotten. They stripped away the fantasy that competence eventually earns protection in systems built on manipulation. They taught me, finally and completely, that if someone needs you confused in order to control you, clarity is not just defense. It is escape. So yes, on some private level I do thank them. I thank my father for sending the text that made the trigger undeniable. I thank Vivian for insisting on witnesses. I thank Grant for being reckless enough to leave a trail. I even thank the version of myself who sat at that glossy table under fluorescent light, heard, "You're selfish and dead to me," and answered with one word instead of a wound. Okay, because that word wasn't surrender. It was a door unlatching. Now, when the day ends and the light turns amber on the buildings outside my office, I sometimes pour a finger of bourbon into a heavy crystal glass my mother once kept in a locked cabinet my father thought was his. I carry it to the window. I look at the city I built a life inside after they tried to push me out of theirs. And I think about how strange it is that the people who set out to make me smaller ended up introducing me to my full size. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making someone suffer. It's about becoming unreachable from the place where they tried to bury you. And if I've learned anything worth keeping, it's this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about punishment at all. It's about precision. It's about peace. It's about walking away with the ledger balanced, the truth intact, and your hands perfectly steady.